Today we'll be discussing the great cowboy song collector, songwriter, and poet Jack Thorp. And I'd like to start with one of Jack's poems. This one has sometimes been set to music, most notably by my old friend Don Edwards. It's entitled, What's Become of the Punchers? What's become of the punchers we rode with long ago? The hundreds and hundreds of cowboys we all of us used to know. Sure, some were killed by lightning, some when the cattle run, others were killed by horses, and some with the old six-gun. Those that worked on the roundup, those of the branding pen, those who went out on the long trail drive and never returned again. We know of some who have prospered. We hear of some who are broke. My old partner made millions in Tampa while I've got my saddle and soak. Sleeping and working together, eating old Coosie's good chuck, riding in all kinds of weather, playing in all kinds of luck, bragging about our top hosses. Each puncher ready to bet his horse could outrun the bosses or any old horse you could get. Scott lies in Tularosa, Elmer Price lies near Santa Fe, while Randolph sits here by the fireside with a flat face on his knee. Gene Rhodes is among the highbrows writing up the West, but I know a lot of doings that he never has confessed. He used to ride 'em careless in the good old days, when we both worked together out in the San Andres. Building big loops we called blockers, spinning the rope in the air. Never a cent in our pockets, but what did a cowpuncher care? I'm tired of riding this trail, boys. Dead tired of riding alone. Believe I'll head old Button for Texas, towards my old Palo Pinto home. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Rex Rideout. Rex is an old-time musician and a scholar of traditional music. He plays many period instruments including mandolin, fiddle, guitar, banjo, and tin whistle. In 2005, he made a recording with Mark Lee Gardner to accompany Gardner's book, Jack Thorp's Songs of the Cowboys. I sat down with Rex during the International Western Music Association in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and asked him to talk about the life and times of Jack Thorp. Here's Rex Rideout.
Nathan Howard Jack Thorp. He first came out into the West in 1886. He was going to school out east, and his father, his family met into hard times and went bust. And they didn't have money to pay for his education, so he headed west, seeking adventure. And for the first part of his time being out west, he was acquainted with the sport of polo. He would break horses out in the west and train them to be polo ponies, and he would take those back east and sell them. And so he was doing that for a little while. And then he decided to, just sort of remain out west. Actually, part of that was that his parents had died, and he didn't feel the need to keep going back east. And so he was staying out west. His adopted country was in New Mexico. He had a ranch in the San Andres, down by the White Sands Missile Base now. And he was raising cattle, and he was working for an outfit where he wasn't a wrangler. His job was to find the stray horses. So that would sometimes take him over county lines and even state lines. But it was 1889 in the spring, and it's getting dark, and he's thinking that it's about time that he needs to think about setting up a camp. And then off on the hill he sees a light, a campfire. Decides camping with anyone is better than camping alone, so he heads over to that light. And as he's getting near, he can hear someone singing and playing the banjo. And they know he's coming. They have some hot chuck ready for him when he gets there. And he says, who is singing that song? And it was a fellow named Lassus. He says, would you sing that again? And you know what that song was. It was Dodgin' Joe. And the young man knew only 2 verses. But that really sparked the idea with Jack that here are songs that nobody knows about, and if I don't do something about it, they're going to disappear. So he decided then and there he was going to do his song search. His song hunt is what he called it. The bunch that he was with was the LFD brand, and that's the Littlefield Freight Drivers. And so they knew the outfit that Jack worked for, and they had the stray horses he was looking for. They assured him that they would get those back to his employer, and he also sent them a note saying that now one of their employees was also a stray, and that was him. And he went off on this song search for 2 years through Texas, and Oklahoma, New Mexico, traveled over 1,500 miles, collecting songs. One of the first 2 that he found, the one was Zebra Dunn. The other one was Jesse James. Oh yeah, and Sam Bass was an early one. Well, Zebra Dunn and Sam Bass end up in his notebook. Jesse James did not. And the reason was that he's really strictly looking for cowboy songs, nothing else. And he felt the story of Jesse James was a little too far east for his focus. This goes on for a couple of years, and then he settles in 1903, he settles in New Mexico, and he marries Annette Hesh, who he called Blarney. And 1903 happens to be the same year that Philip Speckman, A.P. Speckman, moved into Estancia, New Mexico, and he built the Estancia News print shop. Doers of things in ink on paper, good printing always and all ways. Translating made from English to Spanish and vice versa, oldest and best newspaper in the Estancia Valley. So Philip Speckman, he's running a pretty sharp outfit there with this newspaper, and it's 5 years later that Jack walks into that place and he wants him to print up some booklets. He called it a song book, but it's a pretty small book, and it's just stapled together. 23 songs, 5 of which Jack had written. And he paid Speckman $156.50 for 2,000 copies, which totals up to about 8 cents a piece. The other point about that is, this is 1908, and that's a pretty serious amount of money. Thorp, this was pretty important to him. I kind of wonder what Annette thought about the whole deal, that he was putting that kind of money into these books. But he had 2,000 copies made, and he would send them around to different places around the area and put them up for sale. They were offered for 50 cents a piece. Now I've seen copies that are offered for $2,000 if you can find them. They're kind of fragile things, and they don't endure, and who knows how many are left. But that's where it began. Then there was, I think there was a little impulse, event that prodded Jack into making another edition of his book. Oh, and the first book is titled Songs of the Cowboys. easy to remember. But it was Alice Corbin Henderson, and she was a writer and a contributor to Poetry magazine, and she was located in New Mexico. She invited Jack Thorp and Phil Lenore, he lived in Las Vegas, New Mexico, to contribute some poems to an edition of the Poetry magazine. So that was the August 1920 edition. And I think it inspired both of them to make up their own books. It was that same year that Phil Lenore published Rhymes of the Wild and Woolly. And that gives you some idea of what was in there. There's some rich yarns about the old cowboy culture in the wild and woolly days. And then the following year, Jack Thorp put together his second edition of Songs of the Cowboys. This time, the first one was published by himself. This time he has Houghton Mifflin to do an honest-to-God, publishing of this book. And within there is 101 songs this time, 25 of which he had written himself. And where in the first book, he's kind of casual about where these songs come from. And he doesn't say who wrote them, including the ones he wrote. And that came to be something he would regret. Particularly Little Joe the Wrangler came to be a very popular song. And so in his second book, he's careful to give credit to if he knows who wrote it, he puts that in there, or who he learned it from. And the songs that he wrote, of course, he marks that down too. It's kind of interesting that in that second edition, there are 3 songs that he includes by Badger Clark. One is A Cowboy's Prayer, the other is The Border Affair, and the other is The Glory Trail. And in each one of those, you might have thought he would say Badger Clark because that's how he knew the man, but the credit goes to Charles Badger Clark Jr. And probably that came from the publisher themselves, saying we need to get our P's and Q's straight and give proper credit to who holds the copyright. But it was just interesting how that credit appears in the book. So he's published his second book. And it's interesting that there are reviews for that book. The one is from the New York Times. There is a public for poetry out west of which the East knows nothing. That came out shortly after the book was released. And then there's a book review in the El Paso Times. The Man Who Made Poetry Pay. The writer was really impressed that he made so much money on that. He was able to put together a cattle ranch and get several stock in cattle. The book really paid off for him, and he's really talking about that. And that's not true at all. Jack Thorp did not make very much from that first edition. And he really didn't make a whole lot of money from the second edition either. In fact, towards the end of his life, he and Annette, they have a antique shop and a knick-knack shop. And they would sell Indian rugs and pottery and things like that. And he was just trying to make ends meet. He was also a branding inspector, cattle inspector. He was, just doing whatever he could. And he was wishing that he had been more careful about copyrights because Little Joe the Wrangler was a popular song, and everybody's singing it. It's in every songbook collection. Everybody records it. And he actually hired 2 lawyers to try to get some kind of, get some pay coming from that. And they checked it out and said, the time, there's too much time that's gone by. You don't have a tight enough handle on it, and in your first book you don't give credit to it. And so they couldn't do it. And some people say, why didn't he put his name on the ones that he had written in the first place? And I think it was that, he had only 23 songs in there to start with, and he's trying to flesh out the book with his own songs. And if he put his own name on them, then they wouldn't come across perhaps as an authentic song that he learned from somebody out on the range. I think that's what he was trying to avoid. Alice Corbin Henderson, she interviewed him and she asked him, Jack Thorp, for a sketch of his life. And he said, "Just say that I've been everything but a telegraph operator or a preacher."
Jack Thorp wrote the famous cowboy song, Little Joe the Wrangler, in 1898 on a cattle drive from Chimney Lake, New Mexico to Higgins, Texas, on the back of a paper sack. It became one of the most recorded cowboy songs of all time. The events in the song were based on a true story, and Thorp first performed the song at Uncle Johnny Root's Saloon in Weed, New Mexico.
Well, the boys were driving cattle, and they were going from Higgins, Texas they were going from Chimney Lake, New Mexico to Higgins, Texas, which seems contrary to which way you would be driving cattle. But they're driving those cattle, and the most feared thing that happens on any drive is a stampede, and everybody's hell-bent for leather trying to get these cattle controlled. And one of their fellows is killed. He's a young man. He was kind of young to be out there, and he was kind of a favorite with the bunch. And it was hard on all of them that he was killed. And it just kept on Jack's mind, and he kept thinking about it and working on some ideas, and he eventually put a song together, just writing it on scraps of paper. And then he sang it to the boys, and they all thought it was a good song. Well, they finally get back to New Mexico, and they reach civilization in Weed, New Mexico, at Uncle Johnny Root's Saloon. And that's where he first played that song to the public, Little Joe the Wrangler, which, if it didn't make him any money, it certainly put him in the hearts and minds of anyone that loved the West. He would be going from camp to camp and going through towns, and then he would be meeting with someone and talking about songs, or he'd look and there would be a banjo hanging on the wall. "Oh, you play?" "Yes." "Well, I've got a banjo too," and they would share songs that way. And when he talks about his banjo, he said the only unusual part of his remuda was he's got his horse Ample and his pack horse Gray Dog. But he says the only thing unusual was that he had this little mandolin banjo, and he kept that in what he called a malita, that it was strapped over his pack horse. And it's just a half-scale, half-size 5-string banjo that was the lead instrument for banjo orchestras back east. And it was tuned an octave higher than a regular banjo, and so anybody that could play the 5-string banjo could play his little banjo, and he could play anybody else's regular-sized banjo. But it's essentially like a backpacker banjo, from the 19th century. But he was hearing these songs, and he was hearing a lot of different songs that didn't interest him, but he was always looking for the cowboy songs. These guys they weren't being selective. They knew what they liked. They liked what they heard. They were playing the songs that they knew from their family. And, some say any song that a cowboy sings is a cowboy song. And Jack Thorp has been criticized that he was narrowing the focus artificially because he was looking for one type of song. but they were just singing anything they cared to sing. One song that was really popular at the time was Casey Jones, the railroad song. That was one of the favorites among the cowboys, universally. And yet that did not go into Jack Thorp's notebook, and consequently into his book. You know, he was contrary to the idea that, these songs are to soothe the cattle, and we're bedding down for the night. And he said he didn't hear so much of that going on. And he also didn't think that the cowboys had typically, that they didn't really know the songs. They might know 2 or 3 verses, but they wouldn't know the whole song. And he didn't run into anybody who was really a good singer or had a nice singing voice because of the way they were living, and living out on the cold ground and screaming at cattle and then hollering at the judge that it wasn't his rope on that calf. So he was just calling it, and just a falsehood that these stories were about the singing cowboy. And then if anybody was singing, it's usually just one person at a time. There was these harmonies, and if anybody's singing along, they're pretty much just singing the same thing. They didn't really have the idea about singing harmonies as the cowboy bands would do, say, 40 years later.
Jack Thorp was well acquainted with notable folks from across the West, and the great writer and Texas folklorist J. Frank Dobie once wrote of Thorp that his generous heart and delightful talk were richer than any melody.
Jack Thorp seemed to know everybody out in the West. And a good example is that he knew Judge Roy Bean, the law west of the Pecos. And he was visiting with him, and the judge was telling him about this young lady who had her own registered cattle brand. She could ride, she could rope, she could brand those cattle, she could do anything that a cowboy would do. And the old judge was really impressed with her. Her name was Patty Moorhead. And Jack was quite impressed with this story, and he ended up writing a poem about her called The Pecos River Queen. He was acquainted with J. Frank Dobie, who wrote a number of things about Jack Thorp in his books. The one about the Mustangs. He knew a lot of people in the West, and one of them was another writer, Eugene Manlove Rhodes, and they had initially shared the ranches were side by side out in the San Andres, and then Gene Rhodes he married, and his wife was from the East, and she tried to make a go of it out West and just couldn't do it, so they go back East, and that was just horrible for Gene Rhodes. But he's supporting his beloved wife, and then in time, her family had passed away, and they went back west to New Mexico, and happenstance would be that he sees Jack Thorp again. They renew their friendship. So he knew quite a few people out in the West. The first instrument I think of with Jack Thorp is this little tiny banjo that was marketed by Samuel Swain Stewart, S.S. Stewart of Philadelphia. And Stewart was a pretty cagey, he was a smart cookie. He published a lot of books about why his, magazines why his instruments were so superior. And he was coming up with new ideas for the banjo. He invented the piccolo banjo, was the lead instrument for the banjo orchestras that were just becoming to be popular. He invented the banjarine. I'm not making that up. A banjarine which has the same scale as the piccolo banjo but a larger rim. And so he was almost single-handedly inventing this whole idea of the banjo orchestra. Well, Jack discovered one of these probably during his academic days, because the banjo orchestras were being played mostly in the colleges and higher education. That's the only place he would find them. And so he discovered this little banjo. So it was a S.S. Stewart piccolo banjo, but when it was first marketed, it was advertised as being a mandolin banjo. And if you look at the instrument, there's nothing mandolin about it. It's a half-scale, a little tiny baby 5-string banjo. And so Mark Gardner and I, when we were doing our research about we were putting together songs, and we put together the book, Jack Thorp's Songs of the Cowboys, that had artwork done by our friend Ron Kill in Santa Fe. Got to bring Ron into this too. Well, I should say Tom Leach too, of the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe. Tom, he put the whole book together. Well, we were doing our research and contacting people all around the country trying to find out, what is this mandolin banjo? And at one point, it's a painful memory, I'm standing in front of Baxter Black, and I'm holding a Fairbanks Vega banjo mandolin. So it's got the mandolin neck and about a 10-inch pot. And I'm saying, this is Jack Thorp's instrument that he played, the banjo mandolin. And I still can remember Baxter Black's eyebrows were going up and up and up and disappeared under his hat as I'm telling him all about this, this instrument that Jack Thorp played. And then I discovered that kind of banjo was not really brought out until 1910. Too late for Jack Thorp's song hunt. So it's back to the drawing board. And then I find an S.S. Stewart mandolin banjo. I say, here we go. And it's got a mandolin neck and a little 6-inch rim. I said, there it is. Here is Jack Thorp's mandolin banjo. And I keep doing more digging into that. And then eventually I find out that instrument did not come out until 1900. Again, too late for the song search. Well, then there's an August Pullman mandolin banjo that was old enough that came out in the 1880s. But it's an instrument that's a full-scale size banjo, but with like a mandolin or lute body to it, as a wooden body. And it wasn't the sort of thing that you'd be able to put in a pack saddle. And so we were just, scratching our heads trying to figure out, well, what is this instrument? And then I was reading a book that's titled That Half-Barbaric Twang. And I cannot think of the author right now. But she's talking about the development of the banjo. And within that was a source that she gave, the Mandolin in 19th Century America by Scott Hambley. And it was a PhD thesis. Well, I tracked down that thesis. In Chapter 7, he talks about hybrids, mandolin hybrids. And he talks about the mandolin banjo, made by S.S. Stewart, 1885. And there it was. Okay, there's the open door, and I'd charge in there, and I find advertising, the early advertising from Stewart. And by golly, there's that little 5-string banjo advertised as a mandolin banjo. And it's offered in a leather case. Jack Thorp would say that he kept it in his leather case in his satchel over his pack horse. So we had been bending the ears of all the banjo collectors and musical instrument collectors around the country. Like Gruen Guitars and Bowman, who did the banjo book. So and Mike Seeger, we were just asking everybody. Then we found this, and then we let everybody know. And boy, oh boy, did these piccolo banjos get suddenly very popular. And everybody was snapping them up. And Mark Lee Gardner, he had fortunately acquired one before we had released that information. And then the price of these little piccolo banjos went through the roof, and you couldn't find them no more. And I missed my chance. So I had to wait for a decade or so before I could go and get one of my own. But that's a little bit of background for the piccolo banjo. And the one song, that if we're going to talk about Jack Thorp, the song that he's best known for is Little Joe the Wrangler. So I'd like to play it on the piccolo banjo. This is an S.S. Stewart piccolo banjo, mandolin banjo. And Jack's had to have been built between 1885 and 1889. This one is from 1893, as close as I can get. Little Joe the Wrangler will never wrangle more. His days with the remuda, they are done. 'Twas a year ago, last April, he came into our camp, a little Texas stray and all alone. 'Twas long late in the evening, he rode up to the herd, on a little old brown pony he called Chaw. With his brogan shoes and overalls, a harder looking kid you'd never in your life had seen before. His saddle 'twas a southern cack built many years ago, an old K-spur on one foot idly hung, while his hot roll in a cotton sack 'twas loosely tied behind, and the canteen from the saddle horn he'd slung. He said he had to leave his home, his daddy'd married twice, and his new ma beat him every day or two. So he saddled up old Chaw one night and lit a shuck this way, thought he'd try and paddle now his own canoe. So that's how that song begins, and it's talking about the everybody's trying to help the kid out. He doesn't really doesn't know how to handle horses or cattle, but they hire him and they teach him how to be a cowboy. And then there's a storm, a stampede, and Little Joe is killed. It's a horrible loss to everyone, and they feel partly responsible. They feel terrible about it. And Jack was inspired to write this lament to Little Joe.
And he wrote a sequel as well.
Yes, Jack wrote a sequel, and when I got to know Katie Lee, who authored the book 10,000 Goddamn Cattle, which was an actual cowboy song, and she also released an LP of selected songs in there. And when she found out that I was interested in Jack Thorp, the first thing she asked me was, "Do you think Jack Thorp wrote Little Joe the Wrangler's sister Nell?" And I said, I have reason to think he did, because it shows up in these songbooks, these little, they're more like magazines, but they show up like in the 30s, and they're by the Paul Pioneer Company. And here's a selection of songs that Little Joe is in there. Certainly, it's going to be in there because it's a really popular song. But Little Joe the Wrangler's sister Nell is in there, credited to Jack Thorp. And if he hadn't written it, he would have corrected them, because they were deriving, these songs coming from him. And so it seems like then he must have written that song. And it wasn't the big hit that Little Joe was, because it comes out, much later. And sort of, styles change, tastes move on, and it just wasn't so popular. But yes, I think he wrote Little Joe the Wrangler's sister Nell. There was a song that Jack wrote about his night horse. A night horse to a cowboy is their most prized horse. That is the one that's going to save your life. And this night horse did save Jack's life more than once. In fact, that was a horse he was riding when Little Joe was killed in the stampede. His name was Chapo. And if you look up in Spanish, Chapo, well, Chapo means black, and Jack says that the horse was black. It had a O brand on the hip. So he wrote a song about his favorite night horse. Through rocky arroyos so dark and so deep, down the sides of the mountains so slippery and steep, you've good judgment, sure-footed, wherever you go, you're a safety conveyance, my little Chapo. Whether single or double or in the lead of a team, over highways or byways or crossing a stream, you're always in fix and willing to go whenever you're called on, my Chico Chapo. Oh, Chapo, my pony, Chapo, my pride, Chapo, me amigo, on Chapo I will ride, from Mexico's borders, cross Texas llanos, to the Salt Pecos River, I ride you, Chapo. That's a little bit of Chapo. A lot of people today, they take that last verse and they make that into a chorus. But the way he puts it in the book, there is no chorus. That's just the last verse. So that's how I do it. It was Jack Thorp who began this idea of a genre of cowboy songs, and he led the wave, collecting these old songs and trying to preserve, the culture, everything that was going on at the time. These early days of the cowboys and open range and driving cattle, and so he's the one that began this, and for that I'm grateful to the man, and I try to keep people, keep reminding them who he was and the songs that he saved. I'll tell you, he and Annette are buried just up the road a ways, up in Santa Fe. There's the Fairview Cemetery on Cerrillos Road. His brother Charles is nearby. He's a very real part of this area. For a time he lived in Santa Fe. And so I, especially here in New Mexico, people need to know about him. But as I say, his influence is universal, for Western and cowboy culture.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Rex Rideout for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Rex at timetravelmusic.com. I'd like to thank Hal Cannon for playing the Cowboy Crossroads theme music. You can find out more about Hal at halcannon.com. I'd like to thank my Trail Boss patrons, Bob Kelly, Chris Ryden, and Scott Anderson, for their support of this episode. If you're enjoying Cowboy Crossroads and would like to help me keep it going, you can become a patron at patreon.com/cowboycrossroads. That's patreon.com/cowboycrossroads. You can also make a donation on my website at andyhedges.com. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.